It may be that what's special about Earth is not that life began here. For all we know, life could begin in many parts of the universe. But what might be unusual about Earth is that it has prospered for something like 4 billion years and continues to prosper. It's hard to say when we have a sample of one and are thinking about the whole universe, but that probably is something much rarer than the origin of life.
Welcome back to Decouple. Today I'm joined by Professor Andy Knoll. Professor Knoll is a renowned Harvard geologist and paleontologist, recognized as one of the foremost experts in Earth's early history and the evolution of life. He's also the author of A Brief History of Earth. Professor Knoll, welcome to the podcast.
Thanks. Glad to be here.
I've long been fascinated by this wonderful planet of ours. Obviously, unique and special in that it is able to provide the conditions for life. We're the right distance from the sun. We have, a molten core, which gives us magnetosphere, gives us an atmosphere, that sort of stuff. But I've also been, very interested in James Lovelock and the Gaia hypothesis and how the Earth kind of and life on it creates the conditions for life. And so, in reading your book, I was totally fascinated by that exact process, how life has interacted with geology and chemistry. So, really excited to have you on, and I wanted to just get to know you a little bit better by getting a sense of your exact sort of specialty and why it is that you chose to write this book.
Odyssey here really began when I was an undergraduate in college. And like many 18-year-olds, I didn't have the slightest idea what I wanted to do in life. So, in the hope that something might, really strike a chord, I just took a bevy of both science and math courses. And it turns out that I really enjoyed a biology course and I really enjoyed a geology course. And although those were taught in those days as though they were describing separate universes, there was something even in my, a nascent thought in my undergraduate mind that maybe if I wanted to understand the history of life, I would be better off if I could actually place it in the context of Earth's environmental history. And also that if I wanted to understand how environments have changed through time, that it would help to know what biological processes do. And, I don't claim that I had any brilliant thoughts then, but that idea that rather than studying Earth or life, that it might be more interesting to study Earth and life took root then. And that's pretty much what I've done. I've done a lot of work on what everyone calls the early history of life, but it's really the 85% of life's history before animals come on the scene. I've worked on a Mars mission, but it's all in support of this idea that everything we see around us reflects not just the physical Earth with life as an epiphenomenon, nor, as Jim Lovelock argued, that it was a planet by the biota, for the biota, etc. But it's from the interaction of those two things.
I mean, there's a lot of talk about geoengineering right now and the Anthropocene. But maybe like a jumping in point, I don't know, is the Great Oxygenation event. Again, I'm just fascinated by how life has created the conditions, not just for life, but maybe for more complex life, for more biomass, and obviously we'll get to sort of humanity's interaction with that. But either we could start there, or we could, maybe go right back and just get a brief history again of the kind of phases of the planet. I'm not sure. I'll let you choose how you want to approach
Well,
that.
the so-called Great Oxygenation event, or GOE, might be a good place to start because it is a fundamental division point in the history of our planet. The first thing to recognize is that for most of our planet's history, it didn't look like it does today. We do not live at a representative state of Earth's environments. It's more closer to being an end member state in many ways. And in particular, for the first 2 billion years of our planet's history, and that was a biological planet for most of that time, there was little or no oxygen in the atmosphere. So you and I would have died in minutes if we were placed on the Earth, 3 billion years ago. And that all changed between 2.4 and 2.2 billion years ago when various lines of geological and geochemical evidence make it clear that the Earth was transiting to a state that had free oxygen in the atmosphere and surface ocean. It didn't transit to a modern world in terms of oxygen. That wouldn't happen for another, uh, you know, 1.8 billion years. But it was a world in which organisms that breathe oxygen, at least small ones, could thrive. And so there's been a lot of debate through the years, and I played a minor role in it, but I think others have done more. And just now that we know when it happened and what happened, trying to understand why it happened. And again, um, it's very hard to conceive of Earth becoming an oxygen-rich planet in the absence of photosynthesis that, in the green plant photosynthesis you see, outside your window. um, there are electrons that are needed to make, to reduce carbon dioxide to sugars, and they come from water and give off oxygen gas as a byproduct. And so that played a role, but it's pretty clear that that type of metabolism evolved, much, much earlier. And so why is it only at that time that we start to see this, permanent transition in the Earth's surface? And that actually, I think, has a lot to do with tectonics, the physical features of the Earth, in that not only uh, early in our planet's history was there little or no oxygen, but it was basically, we were a water world. There were volcanoes and probably some little nascent bits of continents that stuck out above the water. But it was only around 2.5 billion years ago when there seems to be this large scale emergence of continents, which of course, when they weather and erode, they will put more nutrients into the ocean. So it's beginning to look more and more that the GOE, which may be the most fundamental change in our planet's environmental history, reflects, once again, not just physical events, not just biological events, but how they interacted.
And again, the implications, what resulted due to the Great Oxygenation event, are multifold. Can you go into a few of what those were in terms of allowing, again, more complex multicellular life, or even, in my understanding, allowing life to move on to the surface or even shallow waters due to the ozone layer?
Well, that's an interesting question on ozone, and people sometimes still get into bar fights about that. But it is very likely that with the initiation of a atmosphere with oxygen, that made a stronger ozone shield. Now, it turns out that a meter of seawater would do pretty much the same thing. So I don't. It's not clear that there was, fundamentally anything keeping organisms from shallow water before that. But what does happen is organisms that get their food and energy as we do by taking in organic matter and then respiring it with oxygen. That's how we get our energy. That became a major contributor to the biota and to environmental change after that. And importantly, a group of organisms that was doubtfully on the planet during its earliest oxygen-free history uh, originated, and that's the eukaryotic cells that have a membrane-bounded nucleus, as we do, and plants do, and fungi do, and a lot of protists and that. And of course, through time, the diversity of those groups would grow to become major, major elements in the biota. And as you hinted at earlier, ultimately, some of those groups evolved the capacity to be multicellular, and that paved the way for plants, animals, seaweeds, etc.
Now, you kind of teased at, why this event occurred and nutrient cycles. I was really fascinated to learn that, so nitrogen is obviously super important for protein synthesis, for creation of DNA. Um, but it has been very, very limited over deep Earth history, and the addition of oxygen to the atmosphere made nitrates, made nitrogen that was a little bit more bioavailable and I guess could be fixed with lightning strikes before bacteria got there. But here we have another sort of bacterial geoengineering in terms of making nitrogen more available by putting oxygen up there, but also bacteria developing the ability to, influence this biogeochemical cycle to bring nitrogen into play to allow life to get more complex. Can you go into that a little bit? Again, microorganisms as
Yeah,
geoengineers.
you make a good point that nitrogen is fundamental to life. You find it in proteins, you find it in nucleic acids, you find it in all sorts of different biochemicals that are in your body and the cells of all organisms. And you might think that on a planet where 80% of the atmosphere is actually nitrogen gas, it would be a simple thing to take that nitrogen gas and employ it in the formation of biomolecules. But organisms can't do it. It is not available to life. So you need some process or processes that can alter that nitrogen gas to form something else. And you mentioned an important one, which is lightning. And various people have suggested that lightning on the early Earth might have fixed enough oxygen, to be maybe 10% or so of the fixed nitrogen today. But importantly, uh, certain groups of bacteria and their cousins, the archaea, um, evolved the capacity to actually biochemically alter that nitrogen gas to form ammonia, and then in some cases more oxidized nitrogen like nitrates. And those, again, were very important in allowing the amount of primary production, the amount of photosynthesis on the planet to increase. And the other thing, just to emphasize, is, we tend to think just because we're eukaryotes that eukaryotes are the be all and end all of the planet. But in terms of morphology, eukaryotes are amazing, and they have done remarkable things in terms of biological diversity. But in terms of fundamental metabolism, eukaryotes are pretty dull. We photosynthesize, we respire. Eukaryotes can ferment a little bit, probably only yeasts are very good at it. And we don't really, in a metabolic sense, participate in the nitrogen cycle all that much. All of the key metabolisms that, basically shuttle nitrogen around through the life and environment are from bacteria and archaea. So once again, not only is biology fundamentally involved in the distribution and types of nitrogen we see around us, but all of the heavy hitters are microorganisms.
Yeah, it's interesting now in the era of ChatGPT, the kind of questions you can get answered, and who knows how reliably. But one question I did pose earlier to the great AI overlord was, how much nitrogen was made biologically available or fixed throughout different stages of Earth history, and it was something like, going way, way back, something like 1 megaton in like the earliest parts of Earth's history, the Hadean and early Archean. And nowadays we're up at, I think, 100 megatons biologically with microorganisms, and another 100 megatons, in terms of human contributions through Haber-Bosch. But this kind of increasing availability, I think, accelerated with the Great Oxygenation event, and again with this microbial evolution. So just kind of fascinating how life, including humans, are making these nutrients kind of more available to themselves over time. I understand that's also happening with phosphorus, which is another really important nutrient that's cycling through Earth systems and through organisms.
Yeah, I got a couple things to say there. One is that nitrogen fixation by bacteria takes a lot of energy. So you don't fix nitrogen unless you have to. So in a world where probably phosphorus was in, uh, short demand as well, although nitrogen fixation probably existed as a metabolism, it's not clear that organisms would have fixed nitrogen at the same rates they did later, because you'd have a lot of nitrogen and not much phosphorus, and a lot of it would not get used. Once you have more phosphorus, which begins with this emergence of continents around 2.5 billion years ago and increases through time, then, you know, that expensive energy to fix nitrogen makes sense and more is fixed. And then you made another very good point, which is that largely for the creation of fertilizer, humans now fix as much nitrogen as nature does. And that has consequences. It certainly has consequences for increasing crop yields, but only something like 30% or so of the nitrogen that is spread onto fields, whether you're in North America or Europe or wherever, actually finds its way into crops. Most of it gets carried downstream, and at least in North America, a lot of nitrogen or phosphorus that's put on fields in the Midwest, for example, ends up going down through the Mississippi River and being deposited in the Gulf of Mexico, where indeed it fuels primary production, and it makes these events where there's a whole lot of algae, they sink. The respiration of those algae in the deeper parts of the Gulf actually use up all the oxygen, and we have what are now called death zones because the oxygen is removed. So there are lots of consequences of human participation in the nitrogen cycle. Some of them allow us to feed 8 billion people, and we should be grateful for that. Some of them have more concerning consequences for the environment.
Right, right. I mean, you mentioned how energy intensive it is to crack that N2 molecule. And what really made that hit home for me was just thinking about dynamite and how in reforming that bond, you get essentially, the key ingredient to all of our non-nuclear high explosives. It gives you a little sense of just how strong that bond is. But yeah, I mean, so far we're talking about, again, where these elements exist between the atmosphere, between the geosphere. Oxygen, obviously, one of the most common elements on the planet, locked up in rocks, but I guess also CO2. Um, Speaking about an important element getting locked up in the rocks, I'd like to go into phosphates a little more. Like, why are they important for life? And you mentioned again it becoming more available because of the formation of continents. So why is that?
Okay, well, first of all, we can ask, what is phosphorus doing in our bodies? And once again, phosphorus is found in DNA and other nucleic acids. It's found in the lipids that make membranes. The energy currency of pretty much all life is something called ATP. So phosphorus, like nitrogen, is a critically important element for life. Now, phosphorus differs from nitrogen in that most of the sort of biochemical reactions that involve nitrogen are what are called redox reactions. That is, you can add oxygen to nitrogen to make nitrates. You can reduce those nitrates to ammonia, and it all has to do with the sort of chemical state of the elements with respect to oxygen. Phosphate, which is the form in which we see phosphorus mostly on at the planetary surface, is not particularly sensitive to redox conditions. So phosphate, although it's needed for life, unlike nitrogen, it doesn't enter into energy yielding reactions. It's simply something that has to be absorbed and then used to make these molecules. So the nitrogen cycle then really does come down to sources and sinks. The sources are almost exclusively the weathering and erosion of rocks. And so if you have more rocks at higher altitudes and over a larger area, you will have more phosphorus entering the sea. And so that ties again the history of photosynthesis and primary production to Earth's physical evolution.
We're talking about getting enough oxygen into the atmosphere to enable aerobic metabolism and enabling multicellular life. We're talking about nitrogen becoming more available, phosphates becoming more available. Does that line up in terms of kind of reaching a critical mass of these fundamental nutrients of life with the Cambrian explosion and what's sort of called like the Big Bang of life on Earth?
Well, yeah, so they say. It certainly does. It's not as though there was this continuing small incremental increase in nitrogen and phosphorus availability. You know, at the end of the great oxygenation event, there was probably something more on the order of 1 to a few percent of today's oxygen levels in the atmosphere and surface oceans. It was not a modern ocean by any means, and it remained at that level until something on the order of 600 million years ago, when a number of things kind of happen at once. We have evidence from the chemical record that oxygen is increasing. We have evidence from the geological record that there has been a fundamental transformation of the phosphorus cycle. And we also have evidence that for the first time in more than a billion years, we have Himalaya scale mountains. So and then finally, right in the wake of that, we start seeing macroscopic animals for the first time. So I think indeed, uh, to have large animals that use a lot of energy in locomotion and in things like this and in predation, you do need um, certain minimum levels of oxygen that are probably higher than existed for most of uh, preceding Earth history. That the way to get that oxygen is to get more nutrients, so there's more photosynthesis and more oxygen production. The way to get that is to have tectonic events that again cause more weathering and erosion of phosphorus. So in my view, at least, this remarkable biological event where over, something on the order of 50 million years, we have the origin and early diversification of most of the animal body plans that we still see in the oceans today. And that coincides with, and I think is causally related to, um, events, including um, physical events that basically resulted in a more productive Earth, if you will.
So another big theme of your book is just sort of how unstable, and you just mentioned earlier in the episode how unrecognizable the Earth has been at times. I want to get into talking about carbon in terms of being a key regulator on the Earth's thermostat, but I have heard that the Great Oxygenation event also really impacted the climate as well, and maybe led to even an episode of Snowball Earth. Am I way off base on that, or
Well, it depends who you talk to.
right?
um,
There's some
it's
controversies in this
you,
field.
you mentioned something that maybe your listeners haven't really heard of that much before. Something called a snowball Earth, and we know that at both the beginning of this long Proterozoic era, perhaps 2.4 billion years ago, and again near its end, closing in on 700 to 635 million years ago, there were ice sheets that extended to sea level at the equator. And in some views, pretty much just covered the Earth, including the oceans, with a veneer of ice. Um, However one views the details of that, it's pretty clear that at the beginning of this interval and at the end of it, there were ice ages of a magnitude that we have not seen in the last 600 million years. And certainly they dwarf what has happened over the last 2 million or so. And yeah, there's a lot of debate on what caused these, and one important hypothesis for the one associated with the GOE is that prior to that time, one of the things that kept Earth warm was having methane or natural gas in air. If you read the newspaper about 21st century global change, there's a lot less methane in the atmosphere than there is CO2. But on a molecule for molecule basis, methane is a much stronger greenhouse gas than carbon dioxide is. So it makes an appreciable contribution to 21st century global change. If you think about it, one of the ways to scrub methane from the atmosphere is to add oxygen, because the oxygen will oxidize the methane back to CO2. And many people think, and I think it's a reasonable idea, that as oxygen started to permeate the atmosphere, it caused a real decline in the amount of the greenhouse gas methane, and that could have helped to push Earth into an ice age.
How does life survive a snowball Earth? Like essentially ice over every single continental and ocean surface. I just don't get it.
Yeah, well, again, that's something that people have argued about since the whole idea of Snowball Earth became current, really back in the 1980s. And there are several things that could be happen. It could be that the ice cover is not, literally continuous. That there are places where uh, life could exist in contact with the atmosphere. There are things called cryoconites, which are little ponds on sea ice and things like this, and they have a biota in them. So there's another way of doing it. It may be that where there are hydrothermal vents, both on land and in the sea, you have refuges where organisms could exist. And so in some way, those and probably some other uh, possibilities did sustain a biota. Now, it doesn't mean that nothing went extinct. Very few of the kinds of eukaryotic fossils that are present in rocks before the second uh, group of snowball Earths didn't survive it. So we know that there were extinctions. On the other hand, most of the major groups of bacteria and eukaryotes seem to have existed before the later snowball Earths. And so at least some representatives of those lineages survived and then prospered in after they were over.
I mean, like, not only is it extraordinary that life emerged on this lonely planet, this pale blue dot, but also that it managed to survive maybe in just these tiny few little enclaves during these dramatic periods of climate change. It's bonkers.
Well, you make a good point there, and I think my students through the years were got tired of hearing me say it, but when we think about life as a planetary phenomenon, it may be that what's special about Earth is not that life began here. For all we know, life could begin in many parts of the universe. But what might be unusual about Earth is that it has prospered for something like 4 billion years and continues to prosper. It's hard to say when we have a sample of one and are thinking about the whole universe, but that probably is something much rarer than the origin of life.
Yeah, I think it was James Lovelock. He was asked about whether intelligent extraterrestrial life and humanity would ever interact, and he said, if I'm paraphrasing correctly, essentially, I mean, the universe and maybe the multiverse is so vast that it's essentially a statistical certainty that there's another planet out there with very similar conditions as Earth. But that question of sort of would we achieve complex civilization capable of communicating with radio waves, et cetera, at the exact same time in the history of the universe? Given that humans have been on the planet for the flash in the pan essentially of time, and humans capable of high technology and communicating off planet as well. I mean, it's makes me a little more skeptical about whether those unidentified flying objects are really from an alien civilization.
Well, I think there's 2 issues there. I agree with you that, I don't think we have seen anybody from another galaxy flying around the Earth in my lifetime. Um, but there is an interesting question, it's something that's often called the Fermi paradox because, Enrico Fermi, a very famous physicist, once I think he was just, waiting in line for lunch with friends or something like this, and he just kinda said, "Well, where is everybody?" And, that has been, an important question to, people who call themselves astrobiologists since that time. Most people think, and a recent survey suggested that overwhelmingly most scientists, of all stripes, not just astrobiologists, but all scientists overwhelmingly believe that there is life elsewhere in the universe, and many of them think it's likely that there is intelligent life. Fermi's answer, by the way, is that intelligent civilizations destroy themselves, so we might not see them.
Well, maybe that's a place for us to move over to another key elemental cycle, which is the carbon cycle. We talked about the climatic instability of oxygen interacting and oxidizing methane to cause snowball Earth. Yeah, let's talk a little bit about carbon. I don't know if the Permian mass extinction is a good place to go here, or if we want to go kind of earlier in Earth history, maybe even back to how on Earth, with such a dim sun, the planet was able to stay warm and again maintain that equilibrium required for life to not just emerge but endure. Take it whichever way you want, focus on whatever period you want, or we can do both.
Yeah, well, I think the place to start is simply to realize that if you look at the climate outside your window, there are two major things that determine that. First is solar radiation, and that, obviously plays a major role. But also, there is so-called greenhouse gases in the atmosphere. These are gases that, when radiation comes from the sun, hits the earth, and then is re-emitted as heat from the solid earth, and greenhouse gases absorb that and then radiate it in different directions, and it captures some of that heat. So more greenhouse gases for any given level of solar radiation, the warmer the planet will be. And that seems to have kept Earth in this habitable zone for a very long time. And there was a brilliant paper written about 40 years ago in which it came to be realized that in some ways CO2 acts like a thermostat on Earth, and it does it through its interaction with the physical Earth. So that when a mountain rises up, there is weathering where water and CO2 chemically reacts with the minerals in the rocks. That pulls CO2 out of the atmosphere. It ends up forming carbonate and bicarbonate ions that will go into the oceans and at some point precipitate as limestone. So this whole process of weathering and erosion takes CO2 from the atmosphere and converts it into limestone. Now, what's interesting is that weathering process is itself temperature sensitive. So if you put a lot of CO2 into the atmosphere, it makes the atmosphere warmer, which makes the weathering reactions go faster, which actually pulls CO2 out of the atmosphere and makes it cooler. So this kind of thermostat works to keep us more or less in the same zone over long intervals of time. And I think the idea that life has been sustained for 4 billion years owes a lot to that kind of feedback mechanism. Now, it is the case that on short time scales, that system can get out of whack. My favorite one is the one you mentioned, 252 million years ago. About 90% of all species in the oceans disappeared, a mass extinction at the end of the Permian period. And it turns out that that biological event coincides with huge volcanism in what's now Siberia. Volcanism, something on the order of 1 million times greater than anything ever seen by humans. And that would put a lot of greenhouse gases into the atmosphere. Uh, when you add CO2 to the atmosphere, it has a lot of different events, makes things warmer because the oceans get warmer, they lose oxygen. Um, it becomes harder for organisms that make skeletons or calcium carbonate skeletons like clamshells to make those. And in fact, if you look at the selectivity of extinctions at this time, that selectivity is actually predicted very well by physiological experiments actually run to try and understand what 21st century global change will be. So it's pretty clear that the story kind of goes massive volcanism, big increase in CO2, um, bad biological effects which cause mass extinction. Now, it turns out that through time, the kind of processes that I was just talking about a few minutes ago will bring CO2 back in line. Um, but those are processes that are going to take place over hundreds or thousands of years. So in the 21st century, you can kind of think of, anthropogenic increases in CO2 and other greenhouse gases as in terms of the lifetimes of our grandchildren, they're basically permanent.
And we're emitting a smaller amount of CO2 in an absolute term relative to this incredible volcanism, but we're doing it a lot faster.
Yeah, I mean, there is an issue of really getting almost instantaneous rates of change in CO2 in the past because we have radiometric dates, but those are probably only accurate at best to within a couple tens of thousands of years in their uncertainties. So something that happens on a time scale of a century is not easily picked out in the past. That said, there are some people who have tried to calculate rates of change in things like PCO2, and generally speaking, they come to the conclusion that the rate at which the amount of CO2 in the atmosphere is changing today may be about the highest in known geologic history. So the important thing, whether you believe that literally or not, the important thing is that humans are a major component of environment and environmental change in our lifetimes.
I like to think I'm, really original when I come up with a zinger. So you're far more acquainted with any of this literature than I am. But has anyone called what humanity is involved with right now the Great Carbonization Event?
They haven't. I think you should get a website and just take that name.
Soda streaming the
The
atmosphere.
carbon is always moving around, and through most of Earth history, there was more carbon dioxide in the atmosphere than the worst we contemplate in coming decades. On the other hand, when there was high CO2 in the atmosphere, that coincided with an earlier history of our sun, when the sun was only, let's say, 80 or 90% as luminous as it is today. So, you know, if the sun is less luminous, then you actually need more CO2 to keep the Earth at the same in the same temperature range. So, yeah, this is, yeah, I think a lot of people in science now talk about the present era of the Earth as the so-called Anthropocene, which is the age of technological humans, and I think that's an important concept. We live in a world that is different from previous states of the Earth system, and the big thing that's different about it is us.
Okay, but this is not the first time that not necessarily life, but that the Earth has burned, for lack of a better word, a shit ton of fossil fuels and fossil rock. So, from what I understand, the Permian or Siberian traps you were describing in that massive amount of volcanism, um, a big contribution of the CO2 from that event was not just CO2 from the basaltic magma itself, but as that lava came up, it just burned everything that had been buried there. Coal,
Yeah,
oil,
you're
carbonates.
right, and in fact, one of the things that had buried there were, extensive peat swamps, the progenitors of coal at that time, and it is thought that those could have been important sources of both CO2 and methane. So, yeah, that's you're right, there are knock-on reactions from the volcanism, but it fundamentally comes down to the same event.
Can you teach us a little bit about again, I think there's some controversy among some fringes around, okay, is the CO2 in the atmosphere, is it coming primarily as a result of, combusting fossil fuels, or is it coming more from volcanism? Can you explain that isotopic analysis that sort of helps us settle that question?
Yeah, it is a settled question, no matter what you might see on the internet. And it has to do with the isotopes of carbon. Carbon comes in three isotopic forms. About, close to 99% of the carbon is so-called carbon 12 that has six protons and six neutrons. Another 1% has an extra neutron, so it's called carbon 13. And then many of your listeners will know of something called radiocarbon or carbon 14, which has two extra neutrons. And that's actually radioactive and will decay on a time scale of thousands of thousands of years. So you can go around and look at the various sources and reservoirs of carbon on this planet and get their isotopic composition, that is the ratio of C14 to C13 to C12. Um, we know what that is for volcanic gases. We know what it is for the burning of fossil fuels. We know what it is for pretty much every other potential source of CO2. And it turns out we also know how that ratio has changed over the last 70 years in the atmosphere. And it turns out that volcanic gas just can't account for what we're seeing. On the other hand, what we are seeing is changes in the atmosphere that are consistent with the burning of fossil fuels in two ways. One, the ratio of C13 to C12 is correct. And also, whatever the source of the CO2 is that's going into the atmosphere, it basically has no C14. So it's not just modern organic matter, it's mostly fossil fuels. And so, yeah, I think there is, as far as I know, no controversy on the major sources of CO2. There's some, it's fair to say that clearing of forests does contribute to the increase in CO2 as well, but it's predominantly fossil fuels.
And again, that's because photosynthesis prefers the lighter isotope of carbon. So if you're burning fossil fuels, you're going to have more C12 versus C13.
That's exactly right.
I guess, moving into this Anthropocene, we touched on it a bit before in terms of the way that humanity has put the gas pedal on the nitrogen cycle by figuring out how to crack atmospheric nitrogen under high pressures and temperatures in the Haber-Bosch process. Um, can you talk a little bit more about? We've also talked about obviously humanity's impact on the carbon cycle now. Um, the impact on phosphates, on any other sort of geochemical cycles. I just find it fascinating how, often we think of ourselves as separate from nature, and there's other organisms that had a big impact on some of these cycles. But in a very short time, we've really been able to sort of seize these planetary levers and put them into the red zone.
Yeah, well, we've already talked about nitrogen, how humans have become, one of the most important sources of fixed nitrogen on the planet, with consequences for crop growth, which is critically important when you have 8 billion people on the planet, but also uh, natural environments as well. And phosphorus, humans have important uh, consequences as well. Now, phosphorus, we don't manufacture usable phosphorus in factories, so it's a matter of mining phosphorus, phosphate ores, and again, the rate at which phosphorus is coming out of the solid earth and entering the biosphere, if you will, has increased greatly because of mining. And here there's another fill up that people don't really talk about that much. But in fact, you know, nobody's making new phosphate ores at high rates right now. It's a little bit like fossil fuels that, you know, even if you don't aren't persuaded that fossil fuels are a major cause of environmental change, you ought to be thinking about alternatives because we're going to run out. Um, when you use fossil fuels at rates that are orders of magnitude higher than they could possibly be reforming, sometime you run out. And the same is true of phosphate, that most people think that on, 100 years, maybe a little more than that, we're going to be in some real trouble in that we will not have major resources of phosphorus for again for fertilizers, and what we will have will be more expensive to mine because it'll be lower grade things. So there is not in your lifetime and mine, but possibly in the lifetimes of our great grandchildren, phosphorus is going to be an interesting topic for discussion.
I'm curious as to whether, because what you're saying there is, with declining ore grades essentially of phosphates, it's going to become more challenging. Phosphorus is, not a ultra common element, but it's out there. But we need to find the kind of economically viable deposits to mine. What made those deposits concentrated in the first place? Did life have any role in that?
Yeah, most ore grade phosphates are associated with an oceanographic phenomenon called upwelling. So you have uh, things like plankton, algae in the surface ocean. They die and their remains sink down into the deep ocean where bacteria eat them and return phosphorus to the water column. And then that phosphorus in deep waters is moved by physical currents and actually so-called upwells and impinges on the continental shelves again. And that's one of the reasons why continental shelves have high primary production relative to other parts of the ocean. And it also results in phosphorus, in some cases, to an extraordinary degree, ends up getting buried in sediments and accumulating as phosphorus minerals. So yes, it is once again, biology is involved, and so is the physical circulation of the oceans.
I'm just thinking, the trade war is bringing this to light for me as a Canadian. We've got a lot of phosphates in Saskatchewan. I understand Russia has a lot of phosphates, but they're not distributed equally across the earth as many resources aren't. Is that maybe because of like shallow seas that mean that we have more deposits here in northern Canada and Saskatchewan, or is there an explanatory kind of narrative you have as to why they are where they are at current moments, or
Yeah, again, I don't claim to be the world's expert on why there's phosphorus here and not there, but it is the case that I think Morocco may be the the kingpin of phosphorus mining now. I've actually worked on phosphates from the Ediacaran in China, some of the oldest massive phosphates at 600 million years ago. And so, one way or another, I think the sort of general explanation that I gave is a good one for all of these phosphates. And each one will reflect specific circumstances of, ocean circulation, weathering, primary production, and that, yeah.
okay, so something I'd mentioned wanting to chat with you about, and we don't want to go into too much detail here, but just again to kind of demonstrate the specialness of Earth was some ideas about people who want to colonize Mars and what might make that difficult. There may have been life on Mars at some point, but it's a vastly different planet than Earth, and with features that make it much more difficult to habitate. Um, Based on kind of what we've talked on now or any other of these sort of life chemical geological interactions, do you have any opinions on Mars colonization and why it might be a good idea or a silly idea?
I think there is inevitably going to be some sort of human exploration of Mars just because of, this feeling of manifest destiny and that. Um, I don't get excited about Mars habitation. First of all, hugely expensive. As you mentioned, Mars is dry, it's cold. It is not at the surface of Mars, I would say, in terms of humans at least, it is not a habitable planet now. So, in order to get even, a small base there, it would take, many, many starships to move materials, create spaces where you could actually grow crops. I mean, probably a lot of your viewers have seen The Martian and growing potatoes and things like that. Yeah, maybe. But to have anything that is more than just a local base for explorers would take resources that are really hard to fathom. And some people talk about wanting to colonize Mars because we're ruining the Earth. But it does seem to me that when you think about the resources that would be necessary to make even a toehold on Mars, um, it strikes me that it might make a lot more sense to rehabilitate the Earth, which is not going to be cheap, but it's a whole lot cheaper than trying to refocus human existence on Mars. I think realistically, uh, there are several nations, certainly the U.S. and China, who aspire to make at least bases on the moon. There are a number of reasons for doing that, although I think probably the ability to actually spy on the Earth may be foremost among them. But, I think that's a baby step. It takes 3 days to get astronauts from Earth to the Moon. It would take 6 months to get them to Mars. You can only fly to Mars during a short window every 2 years or so. So, I would say if people are interested in really trying to establish the principle that humans can survive and perhaps even thrive beyond the confines of the Earth, it's certainly a whole lot more reasonable to start with the moon, and then at the very least think about lessons learned before you start heaving starships off to Mars.
I guess in closing, you're a guy who is immersed in deep time, who's thinking back and has a specialty in analyzing the Earth 4 billion years ago. What sort of perspectives does that give you looking at our current predicaments?
It really just underscores the uniqueness and a concerning uniqueness of our own time. I mean, things that we did some years ago. I think we were the first people to argue that this great mass extinction 252 million years ago that we talked about was in fact related to massive increases in CO2 in the environment and how that could explain not only the fact of extinction, but the selectivity of extinction. And when I see what's going on now, the predictions that you make on the basis of what we saw happen in the past are actually turning out to be very, very accurate. So, it really is a distant mirror, to use Barbara Tuchman's phrase. And if anything, it makes one, I think, at least more determined to use human ingenuity, because after all, human ingenuity is what got us into this mess. But t- have some confidence that human ingenuity, if we all work together and have states that actually recognize the importance of sustaining our world for our grandchildren, that we can do a great deal.
In a sense, I think part of the issue with the climate problem is just how difficult it is to solve, given great power conflict amongst a lot of other issues and just basic facts around energy use. But one of the challenges I think is again that things are kind of moving in slow motion, which for you would maybe sound hilarious because moving through years when you're looking back at deep geologic time and trying to make sense of it, again it's a flash in the pan. Um, I mean, does that register for you at all? Just or in terms of your sense, looking at how things are unrolling. I mean, you've lived uh, hopefully a half to 2/3 of a lifetime on Earth. Hopefully, have many more years to come. But again, just getting a sense of your perception of time. And also, sort of how things have come into focus over your career, because it sounds like you've been around while we've discovered and fleshed out a lot of the reasons behind this mass extinction or that mass extinction or this big, planetary event. Like this knowledge is so recent, it strikes me, in terms of theories that have come into focus. Like we've only known about plate tectonics for, I don't know, 150 years or something like that. Like,
Not that much. Plate tectonics happened in my lifetime. It is the case that for someone like me, the rate at which the Earth is changing now is astonishing. I mean, it cannot change at that rate for long intervals of time. So right away, that tells us that we are living in an unusual time. We are living at a time that is likely to get worse before it gets better. But because we have, clever inventors and engineers, we have the capacity to ameliorate much of that change. There are now proof of concept plants in various parts of the world that are actively scrubbing carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere, and it works. Now, it is not yet up to scale because there's a whole lot of CO2 that needs removal if we want to get back to where we were, even in 1950. But these things are possible. But you do make a good point in that I think for many people, it is something that's happening very slowly.
I recognize there's not bugs, getting splattered on my windows anymore, and there's less snow to shovel. If you've lived in a place for 20, 30 years, you can notice some changes, but still, day to day, I don't think human beings are well equipped to observe change that's happening on these longer cycles, particularly urbanized humans. Like I think, maybe hunter gatherer, Inuit or something who are really attuned to their climate and it's really important to them. Or farmers might notice it more. But anyway.
One of the ways I like to think about it and talk to members of the public is to talk about the kind of world we want for our grandchildren. And I think if you start thinking about it that way, you might be more inclined to, you know, take actions now rather than saying, oh, well, there's other things I need to worry about.
Okay, Professor, it's been a pleasure. I highly recommend that listeners pick up your book, again, A Brief History of the Earth. And if people want to find more out about your work, how do they find you? Are you still teaching, or do you suffer from that condition of emeritus?
No, I'm now retired. I'm still researching and writing, but I don't go to committee meetings and don't go to term papers and things like this. So it's bliss. Um, I really don't have a personal website, but someone once described me as eminently Googleable. So there's a lot of stuff about me on the web. So
Yeah, well, I was able to find you fairly easily. Okay, Professor, thank you again for making the time. Appreciate it.
yeah, thank you, Chris.
Today's episode was made possible through a generous donation from the Xerxes Foundation and from listeners like you making pledges on our Substack. If you'd like to join the tribe, please do head over to our Substack, smash that pledge button, or if you would like a tax-deductible receipt, you can hit the donate button and make a contribution through our fiscal sponsor. We genuinely appreciate your support. It is only through your generosity that we are able to continue to offer energy literacy on demand.